It will be badged as a coalition of the willing of like-minded countries, including hopefully some contribution from the Americans. Still, Putin is saying he doesn't want any European troops in Ukraine, but that's one of the concessions he's going to have to make if there's going to be a peace deal. Because after Russia's history in Ukraine, no Ukrainian government is going to just accept any promises that Russians make or bits of paper they sign. They're going to demand some pretty robust security guarantees. What we really saw, I think, at that meeting was the coalition of the willing at leader level coming of age and forming up to Trump as a kind of unit.
Yeah, well, I understand, and I may have read this wrong, but Alexander Stubb has played golf with Donald Trump, and the fact that Donald Trump uses Steve Witkoff, his golfing partner, as his international negotiator, maybe the golf course is the place where a lot of the work is really done.
Yes,
as we've seen elsewhere. But overall, do you think the two summits actually achieved anything? Or were they just good talking shops and people are going to try and put conclusions on them to work out what should have been achieved at the summits afterwards, and we're not really any further forward?
well, the US-Russia summit achieved a lot for Russia, I think, and so it's been then a question of trying to retrieve lost ground. I think perhaps the greatest outcome of that meeting in Washington is what didn't happen. There wasn't the row with Zelensky. There wasn't an effort to strong arm him into accepting territorial concessions, which there could have been. And sometimes avoiding the worst is part of the diplomatic game of making progress incrementally. But it didn't settle anything, no. And it leaves everything to play for, yes. As I said, I don't think it brings a ceasefire any closer. But it has at least got the American administration into the weeds of what security guarantees might look like. And I think there are talks going on as we're recording this among the NATO military chiefs over what the design of security arrangements could, which is an absolutely critical question. Trump is at 35,000 feet on that with a few broad principles. It's vital that we're now talking to the Americans about the details. So I think that was ground gained. And for the rest, it was more that we avoided the worst than that we scored any large number of goals.
Mm-hmm. But do you think, and again, going back to Mark Rutte being there because of the NATO label and Vladimir Putin's red line on anything to do with NATO, the fact that NATO was involved in there, and we've got the defense chiefs from NATO countries in Washington discussing what some form of security guarantee would look like and everything else. Again, it's keeping the NATO label on it. That's giving Vladimir Putin an easy out by saying, hey, I have been consistent the whole way along that there's to be no NATO involvement. And if there is any perceived NATO involvement in the ground, with a label associated with it, you're just trying to bring Ukraine into it. And therefore, in a way, that's almost unhelpful.
Well, I mean, one answer to that is that Putin has brought this on himself, that by having invaded Ukraine, he has actually enlarged NATO. He's brought two countries on his borders into NATO, and he may land up with European troops in Ukraine. But your basic point, I think, is right. I think if this was badged as a NATO operation, it would just be an open goal for Putin to say, I've always said that there's too much NATO in Ukraine, and here we are. I'm confirmed in that. So I think this coalition of the willing label is the one that they will use. In any case, a number of NATO countries like Hungary and Slovakia probably would veto any NATO involvement. And in terms of launching a NATO operation, I think every country would have a veto around the NATO table. So no, I don't think it'll be badged as NATO. I think NATO can provide quite a lot of the kind of underpinning of it, the plumbing, command arrangements, coordination, and so on. But I think it will be badged as a coalition of the willing of like-minded countries, including hopefully some contribution from the Americans. Still, Putin is saying he doesn't want any European troops in Ukraine, but that's one of the concessions he's going to have to make if there's going to be a peace deal. Because after Russia's history in Ukraine, no Ukrainian government is going to just accept any promises that Russians make or bits of paper they sign. They're going to demand some pretty robust security guarantees. So, if it's going to be a deal, then Putin is going to have to accept that. But I agree we shouldn't, force NATO down his throat, which I think would probably be a step too far.
Yeah, but again, are we seeing greater European unity? And I include UK as European unity here, both from a political perspective, but increasingly from a defence perspective, and looking at the way defence in Europe tends to work itself. It's always been very nationally controlled. The French in particular will only buy from French companies. The Germans will try to only do German companies, and then we all try and buy German technology but get it manufactured in our own countries. But are we seeing Europe coming together? And is that a positive that's coming out of this?
Well, I think we're beginning to see Europe coming together. Yes, first of all, we're seeing them coming together politically and in terms of policy making, and that was very evident at the Oval Office meeting this week. Europeans working closely together. I think we've come together with the EU on the issue of defence industrial cooperation, because that's a sort of EU-shaped issue. It's about investment. It's about the regulations that will allow companies to work together. It's about being able to raise massive amounts of money on the markets and so on. So the EU is quite well equipped, and I think it is moving into that area. I mean, there's lots of signs of European defence manufacturing ramping up. So there is more Europe there. I do not think there's more Europe in terms of organising military forces of the thing that you and I both know from NATO command structure, NATO planning arrangements. I mean, those are not going to become Europeanized, I don't think. They will stay in NATO. But the mechanics and the coordination of economic and defense supplies to Ukraine is a good subject for the EU to be taking on, and they are really doing that. So yeah, I think we're moving in that direction. And one of the things that is, I mean, we've talked about it before, but is kind of looming into shape is the idea around European capitals, including London, that we're going to have to expect to do with less America in European security in the decades ahead. For at least since Obama, there's been a sense of the tide going out on American commitment to Europe. Under Trump, that looks like it could accelerate, and we're going to have to fill the gaps being left by the Americans. That's going to take time and money, but there's a process underway now to substitute, and Ukraine has just accelerated that, I think. And so that's one of those generational things that will be talked about long after you and I have stopped commenting on world affairs. But it is underway, and it will go on.
Well, exactly. But do you think Donald Trump shot himself in the foot with this? Because Europe relied on US defense industry a lot. Um, you know, Donald Trump is getting Ukraine to order more US military capability, but paid for by Europe. But at the same time, European defense industry is stepping up its capability very fast indeed, and is now providing credible competition on the world stage to the US defense industry. And that will mean that as people are looking as to where they're going to buy their new sophisticated weapons from, if they've got a choice, which they didn't have beforehand, given some of the uncertainties that Donald Trump's come out with on the use of weapons beforehand, that confidence may not be there, and therefore Europe's going to benefit from this in the longer term.
Well, I think the last point is right in the longer term. I mean, at the moment, there is no European alternative to quite a lot of these high-end American weapon systems. The Patriot missiles, for example, or the F-35 fighter jet, or the kind of oversight, intelligence gathering technology, satellite technology. I mean, the Americans are far ahead of Europe in most of those things. So the very expensive high-end technology, if you want it, you've got to go and buy it from the Americans. And that's going to stay for a while. And of course, yes, the Europeans are now funding Ukrainians to buy Patriots and others. And I see that Zelensky is talking about $100 billion defense order from Washington. So right now, the Americans are doing fine on that. Over time, yes, the idea that the Americans can sort of decide when to switch off their weapons if they don't want you to use them, I think has had a bit of a profound effect in Europe. And over time, we will get European alternatives to the aircraft, the missiles, and so on. The area probably where Europe is going to surge ahead, based on Ukrainian experiences on drones, because the kind of mass production of cheap drones with all the necessary cyber protections and so on, they are the world leaders in that now with Russia. And therefore, if European industry can benefit from the rapid, cheap mass marketing of these sort of weapons, then probably we will lead the world in that. And that's going to be a relevant part of the battlefield in the future.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.